I'm going to read a little bit from an essay that I wrote, the last essay I wrote for my philosophy and history degree on the Chinese social credit system. I graduated in 2022 before AI hit the scene with large language models. So my knowledge was based on everything which had been written in English by Chinese and Western sources at that point. I'll just mention briefly before I read from the essay that one of my most valuable sources was from the Law and Social Inquiry journal, published by Cambridge University Press, entitled From Datafication to Data State, Making Sense of China's Social Credit System and Its Implications. It is freely available online and I would strongly recommend it. Since I read the essay, two major books have been published on the topic, one by a Western author entitled Social Credit, The Warring States of China's Emerging Data Empire, published in 2023, and one by Chinese authors entitled China's Social Credit, Theoretical, Empirical Research and Countermeasures, also published in 2023. As mentioned, I had read neither book when I wrote this essay, but everything I mentioned in the essay was true at the time of writing, and I will mention any major updates as I go. I'll just be reading a brief excerpt from the essay, and the full thing will be available to Patreon subscribers at a later stage this year. So reading from the essay. In July of 2011, anthropologist David Graeber released Debt, the First 5,000 Years. A core argument of debt is that all economic history comprises three underlying, quote, transactional logics undergirded by different moral principles: communism, hierarchy, and exchange, which, quote, always coexist everywhere in different combinations. Just as an aside here, in Graeber's usage, the term communism refers to those type of relations most typical of family relations, hierarchy being that which is typical of governmental relations of superiors and subordinates, and exchange is typical of market relations. In debt, Graeber uses the example of a corporation, which generally engages in exchange with its suppliers and the market, has hierarchical relationships with its regulators, and adheres to communistic relations internally, for example, between shareholders or between co-workers. Back to the essay. Graeber uses these logics to explain changes in the evolution of currencies and economic systems. In October of that same year, the Chinese social credit system, hereafter referred to as the SCS, was officially announced. And just a brief aside here as well, at present there is not one overarching, all-encompassing score, but multiple overlapping scoring systems which feed into one another. The social credit system is still in a period of experimentation. The SCS therefore refers to the social credit system policy framework, and only implicitly to the more unified, integrated system which is still under construction. While SCS scorings are not currencies in the modern sense of serving as a medium of exchange, they do possess the other two features of currencies, that is, the unit of account and store of value functions, and are therefore worth analyzing in this context. That is, they are a means of measuring value, unit of account, which itself holds value over time, store of value. Over the course of this essay, I will explain the main features of the SCS, summarize Graeber's distinction between social and commercial currencies, and his three transactional logics, analyzing the SCS in this context, and thereby revealing its historically novel character. I will then present and critique the contrary historiographic perspective, which stresses the continuity of the SCS with both prior and parallel developments in China and abroad. I will conclude by discussing the future of the SCS and, using Graeber's framework, argue that the SCS is witnessing the emergence of a fourth transactional logic, which I have termed evaluation. The first act of the SCS was the online publication of millions of debt defaulters' personal information by the Supreme People's Council in 2013, along with, quote, restrictions placed on their daily lives, such as bans, quote, from buying flight or rail tickets. This example is illustrative of the primary intent behind the SCS's creation, to enhance the functioning of China's existing institutions. It also exemplifies the comprehensive scope envisioned for the system by its creators, encapsulated by Premier of the State Council Li Keqiang. Quote, those who lose credibility will find it hard to make a tiny step in society. The core metric by which the SCS evaluates individuals and collectives is, quote, trustworthiness, which is treated as essentially equivalent to creditworthiness and antithetical to corruption. There is currently no unified legal definition or evaluative framework for measuring trustworthiness. As such, it is gauged through various data points and evaluative processes. Whilst a, quote, social credit unified code has been assigned to each citizen and organization, scoring programs for individuals have been relatively limited in scope thus far, as emphasis has been placed on scoring incorporated entities. This social credit unified code is used for data aggregation and synchronization, and is identical to each citizen's residential identity card numbers, which are used for tax payments, credit clearance, and related purposes. The incorporated entities referred to include every legal entity. The core mechanism of the SCS is the, quote, Unified Rewards and Punishments, URS, sometimes also translated as Joint Rewards and Sanctions, JRS, which administers public-facing blacklists and red lists on which entities may be listed due to their record of compliance with regulations, triggering cross-sector punishments or rewards reinforced by the private sector. That is, different branches of government collaborate to enforce blacklist punishments and rewards. The SCS operates on a vast scale, incorporating all major government ministries and a multitude of state agencies and branch offices. URS penalties can impact employability, subject entities to public censure, and reduce market access. Private partners to the URS include industry associations and e-commerce platforms. URS listings are the primary determinant of one's social credit standing, reflected in their Public Credit Information File. Public Credit Information, PCI, refers to information generated or collected by government bodies, whereas Market Credit Information, MCI, refers to information collected by businesses. The latter informs the former, though both are governed by similar processes. The areas of the SCS which target corporate, citizen, and government subjects overlap considerably. For example, the profiles of individuals affect the collectives of which they are a part. From 2014 to 2020, the SCS experimented with a wide diversity of approaches, as various subsystems, municipal variations, and pilot cities were designed for specific regulatory goals, such as enhancing the capability of the judicial system to implement court decisions. This period coincided with the transition from the 12th five-year plan of 2011 to 2015 to the 13th five-year plan of 2016 to 2020, as the SCS is integral to the latter's emphasis on building up China's digital infrastructure. Irrespective of which area of governance it targets, the URS functions according to a logic similar to China's indicative planning policies. That is, it prioritizes sectors with, quote, significant negative externalities and subjects them to operant conditioning. Externality is used in an expansive, somewhat metaphorical sense here, to refer to both what are conventionally understood to constitute market failures, for example, environmental pollution, and to other perceived problems adjacent to or outside of economics, which the party state seeks to address. Disincentives for blacklisted entities include restricting terms of credit or issuing fines. Incentives for red-listed entities include preferential government treatment, privileged access to public services, and financial rewards. The SCS is more of a technocracy than an algocracy at present, given its reliance on manual, quote, pre existing administrative databases and lack of automatically issued penalties. I have a source here from 2020 claiming that there is, quote, no known instance as of 2020 of an automated penalty being issued for an automatically detected violation. Furthermore, I quote from a more recent source, the aforementioned book Social Credit: The Warring States of China's Emerging Data Empire, on page 191, chapter 8, on the future of the social credit system. The author writes, quote, punitive mechanisms under the SCS umbrella will remain human driven. The fundamental design of the SCS limits the scope for automation. Any penalties must be related to violations of laws and regulations. Establishing these violations requires human intervention, as Article 41 of China's Administrative Punishments Law requires existence of violations detected by digital tools to be verified by human administrators. China's courts and administrative organs are certainly making efforts to digitize case handling and processing, but automation is still very far away. That is from August 2023. How much of that information is to be believed or may still be regarded as up to date is open to question, given that the European Union and UNESCO have tabled propositions to criminalize the use of AI for social scoring. In UNESCO's recommendation on the ethics of artificial intelligence in 2021, they write, quote, scenarios where decisions are understood to have an impact that is irreversible or difficult to reverse, or may involve life and death decisions, final human determination should apply. In particular, AI systems should not be used for social scoring or mass surveillance purposes. Now, China backed that UNESCO proposal, which seems flatly contradictory to everything which I've read by Chinese or non Chinese authors on the subject. So I treat the future of automation and algocracy as being somewhat open to question. In any case, even if penalties always require a human individual, that still leaves a large scope for automation in the surveillance part of the policy framework. Now, skipping a large section of the essay, coming back toward the end, there is insufficient study on the impact of measurement upon behavior, including the creation of perverse incentives to gamify the system. Human societies have never been subjected to the level of measurement and scrutiny of everyday intimate behaviors, that is, tacit knowledge, that the SCS is conducting, as the technical capabilities and political drive toward such intensive dataveillance did not exist prior to the 21st century. Now, a few things worth remarking on there. Firstly, a lack of tacit knowledge was identified by Friedrich Hayek, the economist, in his 1944 book, The Road to Serfdom, as the prime impediment to the success of a planned alternative to the capitalist price mechanism. The shift in technical capabilities represented by big data has subsequently renewed interest in this early 20th century so-called socialist calculation debate. And suffice it to say, the SCS will have huge impacts on China's economy in the near-term future in a wide variety of ways. It's one of the reasons that, in my estimation, Xi Jinping is the most transformative, for good or ill, the most transformative Chinese leader since Deng Xiaoping, if not since Mao himself. Secondly, on this term, dataveillance, which is a new term, the terms dataveillance and liquid surveillance are used interchangeably in the article which I referenced, From Datafication to Data State, by the authors to describe this phenomenon, as distinct from data-based governance approaches with more limited scopes. So refer to that article for a discussion of dataveillance and liquid surveillance. Back to the essay. Data profiles are mandatory for the nation's nearly 1.5 billion citizens, are continually updated subject to real-time evaluations, and stored in perpetuity with no opt-out or right to be forgotten available. Any similar systems operating in parallel, whether they originate in China or not, may complement but cannot compete with the SES, and are subject to the quote, internet sovereignty of the world's most heavily regulated digital ecosystem. This unique socio political context in which the SES is developing is as much a cause for the concerns regarding its equity and efficacy as the system itself. The efficacy concerns generally focus on the risks of overcorrection, that is, if attempting to enforce internalizing behaviors is unrealistically ambitious and will therefore generate greater difficulties in enforcing existing laws, having the opposite of its intended effect. As Chung and Chen's essay explains, that is the From Datafication to Data State essay. As Chung and Chen's essay explains, the SCS is made possible by a social context of, quote, liquid surveillance, that is, the all-encompassing and pervasive, invisible, monitoring of daily life, which affects the breakdown of boundaries between online and offline realities, and the fudging of, quote, distinctions between tracking, monitoring, and redirecting people's choices, unquote, in both the user interface and backend of digital applications. The normalization of and resignation to pervasive surveillance characteristic of this so-called liquid, just a brief aside, this use of the term liquid is influenced by the thought of Polish philosopher Zygmunt Bauman in his work on so-called liquid modernity, for those interested. Now back to the essay. The normalization of and resignation to pervasive surveillance characteristic of this liquidity is attested to in early survey data. These surveys suggest that support for the SCS among Chinese citizens correlates with lower interpersonal trust, and hopes for the SCS to improve social trust, indicating an approval of the system as an appropriate tool for the job. The SCS serves to enhance security in a number of ways. For example, it is used as an alternative form of credit history for citizens without credit cards or banking. This is especially significant as China has the world's largest unbanked population, in spite of its overall improvements in lifting people out of poverty. There is no, quote, point in worrying, unquote, about the SCS's privacy implications, wrote one respondent to the survey, quote, because it is inevitable that all data is accessible to the CCP, unquote. Now, who does that remind you of? Back to the essay. Cheng and Chen argue that citizens' mandatory inclusion in the, quote, perpetual evaluation, unquote, of their SCS profile constitutes the development of a unique, quote, data self, composed of the, quote, datafied segments of one's behavior, unquote, as filtered, in brackets, decontextualized, their word, by the official ratings of these segments. The Chinese government uses the term credit subjects to refer, rather than data self, which is these analysts' term. This use of the term decontextualization ties into Graeber's account of the development of commercial economies in debt the first 5,000 years, but the relationship, my analysis of the SCS in the context of Graeber's book will be kept to the full version of the essay, which I'll release via Patreon. Back to the essay. This, quote, data self, that is, the reputational profile constructed by the SCS, differs from former notions of character or soul in that it officially mediates the worthiness of individuals, that is, quote, bioselves, to one another using the tools and language of scientific objectivity by means of a vast surveillance apparatus governed by the party state. This, quote, datafied self risks, quote, redefining and overtaking, unquote, the bioself by determining the opportunities available and treatment afforded to citizens, quote unquote, in real life. Suffice it to say, such transformation implies a fundamental revision of what constitutes real life, that is, the erosion of the perceived social and psychological barriers between cyberspace and physical space, as a symptom of this so-called liquid surveillance or liquid modernity. These are the manifest novelties of the SCS, highlighted by analyzing it in a deeper historical context. The discourse surrounding the system's future development likewise attests to the novelty of the phenomenon, as supporters and critics debate unexplored existential terrain. Government statements since 2020 have recognized some of these potential problems with the SCS, in calling for measures to protect the system against bad faith actors, and for rectifying ambiguities through greater standardization of practices and their theoretical foundations. For example, a legal definition of social credit in a as yet unformulated social credit law. Officials have forecast the 14th five-year plan period, that is 2021 to 2025, as, quote, a golden period for SCS development. As an update to that, I will just read from something posted on gov.cn, the Chinese government website, under the heading China Moves to Improve Social Credit System. On June the 4th of this year, last updated on June the 5th, the article reads, quote, China's National Development and Reform Commission on Tuesday unveiled a plan to further develop the country's social credit system. According to the plan, the country will accelerate legislation required to the social credit system while regulating the procedures for utilizing credit information. Goes on to say, quote, a standardized and reliable credit record mechanism will be introduced for business registration, legal services, taxation, customs, finance, and so on. So they are moving ahead with the legislation, but it has as yet not been finalized. Back to the essay. Although the SCS is integral to the Chinese Communist Party's 2021 roadmap for the, quote, construction of a rule of law society by 2025, the party has been criticized by NGOs and academics for substituting the rule of law, that is, equality before neutral rules which are fairly enforced, with rule by law, that is, laws being reduced to instruments for governing society. This critique underpins much of the skepticism directed toward the system's stated objectives. For instance, insofar as the SCS conflates the honoring of promises in general with compliance to laws, it risks reducing the former to the latter. The trustworthiness measured thereby would actually represent the party state authorities' trust in the citizenry as measured by compliance, rather than something like the innate trustworthiness of the subject under evaluation. The possibilities for conflicts within and between data selves are suggested by the scope and scale of the SCS, as it proceeds from its initial testing phase toward the present period of integration. The SCS is comprehensive in three respects: the scope of its surveillance, the effects of its enforcement, and the subjection of all of its subcomponents to the oversight of the national government. Whereas sector and municipality-specific programs adopt diverse approaches, data aggregation and governance are highly centralized, overseen by the National People's Congress, China's highest governing body. Its scale is expanding transnationally through the inclusion of foreign companies and NGOs. It is also interpersonal through its issuance of intergenerational punishments, for example, curtailing the educational opportunities of children with uncompliant parents. And many of my sources listed examples of this intergenerational component. It's worth mentioning. The role of stigmatization in the SCS threatens to further social stratification between score groups. Elements of gamification arise as a byproduct of both the SCS's incentives to cultivate the data self and fears of shaming for failing to do so. This gamification exacerbates the risks of both negative and positive feedback loops in the system. In the former case, fears of social contagion could lead people to ostracize friends with lower credit scores, thereby worsening debt spiraling dynamics. For example, financial indebtedness lowers one's credit score, thereby limiting access to resources and therefore the capacity to repay one's debt. In the latter case, those with superior capital could accrue unfair advantages in raising their profiles by undertaking activities such as charity, which require comparatively less personal sacrifice from them. And I finish the essay with the line, "A term like quantification can be misleading when used to describe the SES, inasmuch as it evokes the idea of rearranging quantities. To the contrary, the SCS represents a radical transformation of both the perceptions and experiences of the contexts and qualities of the lives under evaluation." That was about half of the essay, with the elements analyzing the system in context of Graeber's historiography being taken out. I look forward to sharing the whole thing with you once I've got the Patreon up and running. And suffice it to say, this is the alternative future being built, whether we like it or not, in a more centralized and organized fashion by the CCP, building on the groundworks laid by Western governments and big tech platforms. One form of technocracy or the other seems to be what's on offer for the future, unless we, the people, choose to construct some alternative system. It certainly doesn't seem to be the case that any center left party around the world has any alternative idea of how to make use of machine learning in governance, or even how to regulate existing technology like social media. So we're in for an interesting second half of the 2020s, uh, likely to be at least twice as interesting as the first half. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to sharing my second video essay with you. Hope I can get it done soon. Thank you for your support.